again. This is Jim Hogue back with the houseAPC Corner. And today we have a guest who was with us a few times in the past, maybe a year or so ago. And he has his wonderful book, which is Our Country Then and Now by RichardCook. And I have known him since we met in about 2014 in California. I don't remember the date of that conference, but something like that. And I have admired his work ever since, and he certainly is a person that we must pay attention to if we are looking for monetary reform and sort of like the history of what went wrong. And I wanted to introduce our talk kind of the same way I introduced the talk I did with Emily Payton last time, which has to do with gold, because most of the world considers gold to be the basis of what we call money. And the conquistadors stole it from the Aztecs and tried to bring it back to Spain when they weren't attacked by pirates. And that was because money needs to be expanded into the economy so that trade can take place. And so that, much more important to the kings and queens, war can take place. So that the reason they stole gold was to fight wars, was to pay the soldiers to fight wars, more than to build canals, which, by the way, is talked about brilliantly in these two books, Sacred Economics by Charles Eisenstein and Debt the First 5,000 Years by David Graeber, that this pillage contributed more to destruction than it did to the building of communities and trade and prosperity. And the colonists in the late 1600s and into the 1700s got the bright idea that they wouldn't get stuck with the need to have Spanish dollars, etc., for buying and selling. They would create a scrip. And this would exchange throughout the states individually and throughout the colonies. And it was extremely successful. Businesses boomed, trade expanded, because they rejected what we call today debt money. Not that there wasn't an obligation associated with a scrip, but the benefits weren't sucked off into the banks. And the Brits weren't very happy with that. And as far as stealing gold, one of the biggest thefts of gold was when the Brits attacked the Boers in South Africa and stole all their gold. And that was a brutal and horrific war that very few people even know existed. And there's a great movie about it with Brian Brown and Edward Woodward. I forget what it's called. But I just wanted to point out and give Mr. Cook some ground to work from, that gold and the debt money system has been something that we have been working against for a very long time. Okay, so Mr. Cook, I didn't give you a glorified introduction as you deserve, but anything you would like to say that got you to where you are right now, I think it's better to have you say it than to embarrass you with all these glowing praises. So go for it.
Thank you, Jim. Good to see you. Speaking to you from the dead of winter in Maryland here now. Mm-hmm. We've been digging ice out for a week, and finally we are able to drive around. But I wrote this book based upon a number of things, including my own federal government career, where I spent 32 years as an analyst for the civilian side of government, and that took me through the Carter White House, took me through NASA, where I was a witness to the shuttle disaster in 1986. And then finally, I ended up in the U.S. Treasury Department, where I began to study the history of the United States monetary system. In fact, I developed and taught training courses on that. When I retired from the government in 2007, I began to publish books and articles. My first book was Challenger Revealed, on the inside story of the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster. But then immediately I went on to monetary issues, because when I was with the Treasury Department, I began to study the colonial history of money, which you described, and how that transitioned into the federal system of money. And that brought me to meet a guy named Steve Zarlenga, who was the head of the American Monetary Institute, who had just written a book on the lost science of money. And basically, his idea was kind of along the lines of the greenback system during the American Civil War, that the federal government ought to spend money into circulation and not just borrow it from rich people or the banks. And that was a revolutionary idea at the time. And we began to work together on this, and we came up with something we called the American Monetary Act, which actually put this idea into a system. And we then began to work with Congressman Dennis Kucinich, who I met when he was running for president in 2004, running for the Democratic nomination for president.
Yeah, me too.
Got to know Dennis. And then I introduced Dennis to Steve, and the three of us began to work together. And I gave Dennis a one-day seminar on monetary history at an apartment on Capitol Hill, and his young wife, Elizabeth, was with him and some other people. And Dennis said this was the best policy briefing he'd ever had. And coming out of that, Dennis wrote a model legislation for a new monetary system for the United States, which was called the NEED Act, N-E-E-D, of 2011. And that was putting a modern version of greenback funding into place. He introduced it into Congress. It was never voted on. And part of the problem was that after Dennis did that, the powers that be gerrymandered him out of his congressional seat, and he's never been back to elective office since then. But the NEED Act is the most progressive system of monetary reform that's ever been written for the United States, and that remains on the books within Congress. And so one of my main focuses over the last almost 20 years now, since I retired, has been to explain and promote the NEED Act as a monetary reform solution for the disasters that we are in today, and that we're probably going to be in for a long time. And that's really one of the focal points of my book. So I finally, after working these ideas for quite a while, met with my cousin, Johnny Lathrop, in Texas, and he's the family archivist. And we worked together on our family history, and we traced our family lineage in America back to the Pilgrim migration, the Great Pilgrim Migration of the 1630s and 40s. And that's when the Puritans came in from England, and they formed the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And over the next century, the Massachusetts Bay Colony became probably the most prosperous region on the planet as far as standard of living was concerned, as far as equality of the means of survival were concerned. And it was because they worked hard. They had a strong Christian ethic, which called for fair dealing, conscience-based financial practices. And they had no banks. There was not a single bank in New England at the time, or in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Well, where'd the money come from? Well, some of it came from trade. They were great traders, ship owners. They took part in the trade from the West Indies to England. They produced what they called naval stores, which was tall uh, uh, white pine timbers for ship masts, turpentine, tar, all that stuff. So they worked hard and they produced. They also created the first iron industry in America. It was produced in the Massachusetts Bay Colony near the town of Weymouth. And it so happens that our first English ancestor, Thomas Bliss, who was the progenitor of a huge family uh, that has many members of that family to this day, including my cousin Johnny and myself. Thomas Bliss was a blacksmith. And Thomas Bliss lived near Weymouth, Massachusetts, and helped to create the American iron industry in that area. And it expanded, but it required a monetary system. And so what the government did of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, they acquired silver and they hired a silversmith to make that into coinage. They also developed and printed paper money. They actually ran it off a printing press. And the government of the Massachusetts Bay Colony spent this into circulation on buildings, on public works, on supporting the churches of the time. And this paper money in circulation created the prosperity that became the backbone of the New England economy, which spread into the Midwest. My ancestors went all the way to Kansas and Oklahoma. It was the great Puritan migration moving west that created the prosperity of America during the early part of the 1800s, and which actually fought the Civil War, which defeated the slave owners of the South during that war, when Lincoln, through his congressional supporters, created a system similar to what the Massachusetts Bay Colony had, which was printing and spending into circulation the greenbacks. And this paper money stayed in circulation all the way into the 20th century. Now, what did that replace? Well, it replaced the bank debt system that was put into place by Alexander Hamilton during the first Washington administration. Because Hamilton was not about to let the government print money. He created a system that was a clone of the Bank of England, where essentially the government would borrow money from the rich bankers primarily, in the Netherlands, in England, and in America, chiefly Philadelphia and New York, and they would use that debt to create a federal budget that would spend beyond our means, with the assumption that conquest through war would allow the government to pay off that debt, because the biggest expenditures under that system was for war. It was for the Army and the Navy. And by some strange coincidence, Alexander Hamilton had pictured himself as the chief general of that Army and Navy that was going to go fight fight France on behalf of England. He even got himself a nice spanking new uniform to wear, but he was foiled when President John Adams made peace with Napoleon. So there was never a great war with France in the late 1700s the way Hamilton wanted there to be. Instead, Adams tightened the belt, lived off customs duties, and never created the magnificent war system that Hamilton had envisaged. But you carry this all the way through into the modern times, and the debt-based federal system was actually made permanent with the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. And that is the bedrock system that has created today's federal debt of $38 trillion and growing, annual interest payments of almost $1 trillion a year, hyperinflation, which since World War II has eaten the middle class alive and which continues to do so, uh, uh, a whole system of economic deregulation, which gives the banks tremendous power, not only over our country, but over every other country that is sucked into the system, because the main characteristic of a debt-based system is you're constantly staving off bankruptcy. And the way you do that is you constantly conquer other nations and take their resources. You take their oil, you take their minerals, you take whatever you can get your hands on, even as your own economy is hyperinflating and losing value by the day. That's the system we are now in. That's the system that Reagan, I get him and Trump mixed up, that Trump has been trying to counter with this predatory tariff policy where if you can't take another country's resources, you take their money through raising tariffs on them, and you call that prosperity, but once again, it's a race against bankruptcy. So the whole system is corrupt. The whole system attempts to eat the world. That puts us in competition with every other nation that wants to eat the world, including Great Britain and China. And it's a system for endless war and endless creeping poverty. Okay. And that's the disaster we're in today. And to explain how we got there through American history was really the purpose of my book.
All right.
So anyway,
Well,
I wasn't going to talk a long time, but
well, it's okay.
That's it in a nutshell.
I kept thinking of questions and points to bring up, and now I've forgotten most of them. But I did make a couple of notes. I wanted to add that it's not only that it puts allies in competition with one another, but it can create an enemy out of an ally. And yeah. I know that you've read The Hidden History of World War I, and you know all about how Germany was created as an enemy to fight World War I because they were getting somewhere economically. But I also wanted to mention, well, I want to mention a lot. Let's go back to the beginning. Did you ever read 2 Years Before the Mast by Richard Henry Dana?
Yeah, I read that in college.
Yeah, I read it in high school. And
okay.
You made me think of it when you were talking about the prosperity in Massachusetts. And one thing I wanted to add to that was that these were sailors coming into Boston from all over the world.
Right.
Some of them were religious, and some of them weren't. And Boston became accustomed to a kind of liberty, a kind of freedom that Puritans might have been shocked by. You know, they drank a lot. I mean, rum was sort of like water for a lot of that period. And Ethan Allen, by the way, picked up on the iron. He started an ironmonger operation when he was young. And I didn't realize where it had started in Weymouth. So I just wanted to throw out the kind of new expression of freedom that occurred, not just because these were people who left England and the Netherlands and, to practice their religion, but they ran into this wild world of different people in Boston. And I think that may have helped create some of the enthusiasm for freedom that the world never saw before and has never seen since, I might add. It became a visceral, spiritual thing. And even though only, they say 3% of the population actually fought in the War of Independence, it was out there. It was a spirit that people were accepting as something that was good because they were so prosperous from it. So I'll just mention that, and I want to jump to the 7 countries that Wesley Clark said had to be toppled in, 15, during the Bush administration. And
Right.
So when you say that the competition of a debt-based society can make enemies out of your friends, it also is an immediate threat to the debt-based system if countries don't buy into it. And
Right.
those 7 countries that he listed, I won't go over them, they all had their own monetary system outside of the City of London, outside of the big banks.
Right.
And in my personal interpretation, this is just me, is that those 7 countries were targeted because they were not chained, they were not tied to the debt-based monetary system. And so they had to be destroyed, which surprised Wesley Clark when he first learned about it. But I think personally that was the reason they were all targeted. It had nothing to do with terrorism. It had nothing to do with any of the things that they said it had to do with, especially with Libya, which was like everything I've read about Libya was practically heaven on earth, with the educational system and the money given to newlyweds and the whole water, everything about it, and the satellites. And anyway, that all had to be destroyed because it wasn't tied to the central banking system. Again, that's my opinion, and I wonder if you would want to comment on any of the stuff that I have just mentioned.
Well, Libya was in the process of creating its own monetary system using what they called the gold dinar, which Gaddafi saw as a functioning currency for Africa.
Yep.
And yeah, they attacked and they destroyed that. Also, Saddam Hussein was in the process of converting trade in oil into a local currency and taking the oil system out of the debt-based monetary system, which Kissinger had painstakingly built up in the 1970s after Nixon got off of the international gold standard. So yeah, the whole system of the petrodollar was based upon debt, and it was based upon the hyperinflation of oil prices, which then the nations of the Middle East that were using the dollar, particularly Saudi Arabia, then funneled back into U.S. banks. And that became the collateral for massive lending by the U.S. banks that during the 80s and 90s essentially bankrupted Latin America and Southeast Asia. And so, yeah, all that was tied in, because what it does is it illustrates the fact that this debt-based system constantly has to be fed with new collateral. It constantly is overextending itself, because what it does is it creates bankruptcy in any nation or any system or any business that is unfortunate enough to go in debt to the banks. And that's why so many U.S. corporations have as their first priority to stockpile cash so that they don't have to borrow from the U.S. banks. And so what that does is it puts the banks in a position of becoming essentially casinos of gambling and speculation, which is why a very large proportion of U.S. banking assets are tied up in derivatives, which has nothing to do with producing anything. It's just playing games with rolling over debt and kicking the debt can down the road in order to stay afloat, and that's what we have today. That's what created the crash of 2008, because they collateralized liar's loans for mortgages. And when all that caved in, the government had to come in and produce a lot of debt that was put on the books of the Federal Reserve to rescue the system. And they learned how to do it that so well that it got them through the COVID pandemic, got them through the relief payments for COVID, And now the stock market taking off under the borrowing that's being done to build big data centers for AI is just the latest bubble. So the building, the tearing down of debt bubbles, again, it's all just part of the same system. But in regard to the seven nations uh, uh, that Wesley Clark listed, of course, all of those, six of those seven nations have essentially been destroyed and taken over by the Western banking system. And the only outlier now, of course, is Iran. And so there should be no surprise to anybody that Iran has become the target because it's the only one of the seven nations that were targeted back then that is still standing as an independent entity. But again, it's all part of the same thing.
Yeah.
Iran is part of BRICS, which is part of building a new financial system independent of the Western banks. And so obviously, any nation that succeeds in doing that has to be destroyed. And that, of course, is the underlying logic behind the attack on Iran. Not to mention, of course, that all of these seven nations were part of the creation of Greater Israel, and Israel being so tightly wound into the banking system through the big banking families, such as the Rothschilds, it's all part of the same system. And so Tel Aviv is New York, London on the Mediterranean. It's all part of the same banking system and part of the biggest uh, ownership of the Federal Reserve and other banking systems comes out of Tel Aviv.
Okay.
So it's all part of the same system.
Right.
But it's all based on war, conquest, and the sapping of resources from whatever nation happens to be victimized.
Okay. And you've just reminded me that in the sequel to my book, Rack, I get into that very thing that you talked about, is that the child trafficking and the blackmail network is centered in Tel Aviv. And,
Right.
and you take that into the Balkans, you take it into all these other countries that have to be destroyed in order for that whole system from the city of London through Tel Aviv can prosper. And with Iran there, you know, poor old Donald Trump, my heart bleeds for him. He's caught between MAGA and getting his head out of where it shouldn't be, having to do with Netanyahu. So is there anything you want to add to that predicament that we find ourselves in? Oh, shoot, we only have a minute and a half. Because there are so many people like Craner and the Promethean gang who thinks that Trump is the knight on the white horse coming
Right.
in to get us away from the British system. So do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, the phrase red herring comes to mind. And of course, it goes back to LaRouche. The Prometheus are dyed-in-the-wool LaRouches, and LaRouche, everything that ever happened can be blamed on the British and the British Empire.
Yeah.
Not kind of overlooking the fact that the British Empire is really owned by the Rothschilds and was a tool for the creation of Greater Israel and the financial system that is part of that network. And so I think just pointing the finger at the British Empire is a little bit out of date. Yeah, once upon a time it was a big deal.
Well, they
But
did.
then the U.S. took it over, and it was folded into the Rockefeller Empire and into the whole debt-based system that we're in today.
Yeah.
So yeah, a bit of a red herring there, I think.
Yeah, people can grab onto that red herring because of the Balfour Agreement that
Right.
really got everything going.
Right.
And by the way, my parents had inadvertently saved the New York Times from 1948.
Okay.
Absolutely full of the new country called Israel.
Yeah.
I mean, the only
Yeah.
other thing in the paper was ads from Bloomingdale's and stuff like that. Well, anyway, Here we are at the end of a half hour, and I hope we'll do this again. And this has been Richard C. Cook, whose wonderful book, Our Country Then and Now. I'm sure you can just Google that or look for it, and you'll be able to pick it up somehow. And we will talk again. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jim. It's always great to talk to you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
See ya.